We are going to touch upon decentralization as well at some point, hopefully. So just to set the context, what are some advantages and disadvantages of centralization? And then when we touch upon decentralization, we'll go through the same analysis. So let's talk about central banks first. What are the pros and what are the cons?
Sure. Let's start with the pros, as I like to always sandwich pros, cons, and then go by a little of another pro or two maybe at the end. So we'll go with this pro sandwich.
Okay.
The pros are, since it's disaligned from political interest, most central banks can be independent and produce monetary policy that effectively governs the economy, but is dedicated for the welfare of the people, which may or may not be the case if the interests are aligned or disaligned in a scenario of political interest. So the mandate for central banks in most economies is to create a working condition for banks to operate and for individuals to be able to approach these banks and use their deposits or allow for the issuances of loans. And so the pro of that is there's a centralized unit, a centralized control, a centralized authority that monitors the total amount of money in an economy. And let's talk about what a total amount of money in the economy really does. If you and I, and we talked about this a little bit with the bushels of wheat example, is if you and I could just increase money in the economy somehow, then we would always have this mistrust of if money is real or not. If you and I could somehow just happen to magically create money, then we wouldn't really know how much money there is in the economy. And if this idea of prices or this unit of value that we talked about and discussed really is worth it, because if the unit of value was $1 before, now we've just increased the total amount of money in the economy by several fold. Maybe this $1 is no longer $1. Maybe it's that several fold that we just increased there. If it's 5x, then it's now a $5 idea. And so the central bank helps eliminate this idea of the increase in monetary supply because they regulate how much money is printed and distributed in the economy. It also serves the purpose of managing financial risk. And this was seen several occasions in several countries. Most notably, the biggest one occurred a few years ago, about maybe 15 years ago, in the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, where almost every economy in the world had some issue with how their banking sector regulated loans and issuances of loans. And so what happens is the central bank dictates how much money private banks need to keep under them so that when you and I go and ask for our savings back, the banks just don't run out of money. And this is something called the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio simply means that if I store $10 at a bank, the bank has to keep some percentage of it with them. So over time, when I go back and ask them for some amount of my money, they have that money physically with them to give. There's also another concept of reserve requirements. And the reserve requirements is simply to make sure that private banks are not running very loose on their loan part of it. We discussed the accounts part of things, now we're going to discuss the loans part. So the reserve requirements are, over time, banks are not allowed to go and distribute more loans than they should based on some ratio of the assets they hold. And their assets are simply how much monetary supply they have or how much circulation of coin they have, or what their physical assets are. So it's some proportion of that asset base, and that's how much loan they can issue at as well. So these are sort of the two most important concepts regulated by the central bank. And lastly, the last pro that I want to discuss is, since they are independent and since people believe in them, and we talked about this network effect, they can regulate the ups and downs of an economy. So when the economy is running really high or the economy is doing really well, they can increase the cost of money. So they can sort of raise interest rates and increase how much money costs for you to invest money, and then thereby reducing the overall heat up of the economy. And vice versa, when the economy is not doing too well, they can sort of say, oh, okay, we're going to give out money to people or distribute checks to people or increase the overall distribution of money so that everyone has money in the present. They can spend the money, the economy sort of survives and recovers. And then as soon as the economy recovers, they pull back the money and then take back whatever extra money that distributed over time. So these are sort of the ideas of centralization and how centralization helps. What are the cons? Well, the cons are similar to the cons of a centralized economy or a centralized version of some sort of system. And one of them is, well, there are a few people in power that decide these regulations or that decide these open market committee meetings. And most people have to trust these people. Most individuals or people in the economy or you and I have to trust these individuals and hope that these individuals are doing the best in the welfare, best that helps the economy and improves the welfare of the people. And so it's a lot of power with a few individuals, and we hope that they are doing the right job, but we don't really know. And in hindsight, you know yes or no, but at the point in time, it's harder to understand if they are doing it well or not. The other con you can take is sometimes you're influenced by the past and you use precedents from the past to evaluate current conditions as well. So the newer sort of ideas are not enacted upon as quickly as possible because renditions of the past have helped times and periods of depressions in the past. And then hopefully people assume or bankers assume that they can use those same sort of ideas and same manuscripts to resolve issues in the current modern time period as well. The issue with that is the modern time periods are very different from what happened 70 years ago. Distribution of money was not as easy, or the regulation or understanding of monetary policy was not as conveniently available. Education wasn't as freely available, and so this idea of conventional wisdom comes into play. And this conventional wisdom idea is one of the cons, in my opinion. To wrap it up, I want to come back to another pro, and one of the ideas of the central bank is the central bank also understands and helps with economies around them. So, for instance, what happened very recently during the pandemic, or when the early onset of the pandemic, is the Federal Bank of the US decided to create and increase the dollar lines to other economies. So when other economies needed US dollars to purchase maybe commodities or to purchase oil for their economy, they opened up these central lines for emerging banks to just have a direct dollar line or dollar credit line from the federal government. So the pro with the Federal Bank of the US was that since it is a centralized source of power, decisions can be made much quicker. And this decision was made in about 1.5 months, and the enactment of the decision occurred in May of 2020, which is much harder and is a much lengthier process if the decision making is more distributed.